Now, in the last clip, we talked about stacking events. We talked about how you can create a lot of different event triggers within a single Wise event. However, there's an important caveat to this that you need to be aware of. In a 2D game where the physical position of sound emitters is unimportant, this works perfectly. You can create some really elaborate event structures within Wise. However, if you have 3D emitters, which is to say, within the 3D world of your game environment, you're going to have different emitters for different types of sounds. Like, say, if you want these honks to come from actual cars within the game, this is not going to work for you. Wise events require that if you have multiple audio emitters that you're triggering with a single event, that they are all attached to the same game object. If not, if you're trying to trigger various event emitters within the game engine with a single event, then ultimately the position of the event itself is where all of those sounds are going to play from. They're not going to be playing from their various 3D positions. So this is really important to note, is that you can only stack these instructions within a Wise event so long as they are all coming from the same 3D emitter. But we haven't actually talked about 2D versus 3D emitters at all yet. So let's backtrack a little bit and look at what that looks like. City traffic is a good place to start. City traffic is an ambient loop. It's an environment sound, and we don't necessarily want it to be coming from a particular place within the game. This is going to be a 2D event, which means it has no physical positioning in game. So let's take a look at the positioning tab of this event. And you'll notice that by default, it is in fact a 2D event. So when this is triggered in the physical environment of your game engine, it doesn't matter where the actual object is sitting in the game that is going to be triggering this sound, it will always sound like a 2D stereo image to the player. However, let's say we want these honks to come from actual vehicles. Then we want to go into this drop-down menu and switch this over to 3D. 3D means that the sound, even if it starts as a stereo audio file, will automatically be merged down into a mono source, and that mono source can then be physically placed into your game environment. One more thing to consider here is that even though this sound might be in 3D, it will have no volume taper in the way that you would expect from a real 3D sound, which is to say that even though you'll hear it positionally in the game, if you're facing away from it, you'll hear maybe more left or more right to give you some positioning information, but you will not hear it get quieter as you walk away from the object. By default, that does not happen. You have to set that up manually, and that is what this attenuation section over here is for. So let's go ahead and create a new attenuation for our honk sound. You can make it as specific as that, calling your attenuation honks, or you could go ahead and create an attenuation called 3D ambience emitters, level specific maybe. So as you can see, this is a share sets thing. If we go into somewhere else and we want to create some attenuation, that will be available to us. So generally it makes sense to create groupings of attenuations according to specific types of game objects. So let's go back to our honks. We've created our honks attenuation, and now let's edit it, which is to say set it up how we want it to sound. By default, it uses a value of 0 to 100, and this 100 number, this represents in-game units. So you need to coordinate a little bit with the rest of your design team to understand exactly how many in-game units are represented here. Is this virtual feet? Is it virtual meters? Or is it something else entirely? Just to give you a sense of what this actual value means, what this distance will look like in-game. And then from there, you can set up your max distance. Max distance is the value at which you no longer hear the sound. So you could change this to say 50, we'll say that's 50 feet. So if you're further than 50 feet away from a vehicle, you're not going to be able to hear it honking. There is a caveat to this. Any curve that you have in Wise, if you double click on the curve, you'll get a new point. Let's say I bring this up here. This means that at max distance, the volume of this object will be minus 18 decibels. If you move past that max distance, if you're going 100, 150 feet away from that object, you will still hear it at minus 18 decibels because you haven't actually reduced the volume to an unlistenable amount. So just be aware that if you're setting your curve above the bottom volume, you may hear this far beyond your max distance. Just something to be aware of. Now, attenuation curves can get quite elaborate. If you look down here at your curves, Most of these are set up to not exist, but you can go in and you can create low pass filter curves, you can create high pass filter curves, and you can really start to customize what something will sound like according to the distance you are away from it. Just so you're aware, there's a lot here that you can do to make this sound more interesting. But for starters, I just want you to be aware that 3D attenuation is something that you'll generally want to set up, and it's quite important to getting a natural 3D positioning for your sound.